tale called The Ghostly Little Girl, and it's adapted from a story by Robert San Souci. It's intended for an audience of teenagers aged 12 to 18. In the seacoast town of Monterey, California, lived a widowed fisherman named Richard Coulter and his young daughter, Maria. Maria Coulter was a pretty but strong-willed girl. Her father worked very hard fishing in Monterey Bay and the Pacific Ocean so that his daughter could attend the Catholic school in town. Maria was very popular with her classmates at school, though their parents didn't approve of her because her father was so poor. Nonetheless, she had 3 very good friends, and their names were Annie Kelly, Susan Cook, and Catherine Hopper. In the early spring, Maria was absent for several days. When her 3 friends asked their teachers about it, all they were told was that Maria and her father had sailed out of Monterey Bay 3 days before. They were last seen by another fisherman around noon. Their boat was just beyond Point Lobos. "But I saw her this morning on my way to school," Annie told Susan and Catherine. "She was standing across the street watching me. I waved to her, but she didn't wave back. So I don't think she saw me because she ran away right after that. I didn't see her again." But once again, Maria's desk at school was empty. The 3 friends talked about her absence as they walked home. "Maybe she's sick. I texted her the other day, but I didn't get a response," Annie said. "Or maybe her dad's sick and she has to take care of him. You know, I tried calling her, but it just goes straight to voicemail," said Susan. "I think we should go see what's happened to her," Catherine said decisively. And so the girls decided that they would pay their friend Maria a visit, for they knew that she lived in a shanty just outside of Monterey. They decided they would go right after school, and so they did. But the walk was long, and the girls took their time strolling along the beach. It was very late in the day when they saw, far down along the shore, a single cabin with its back built upon stilts that extended into the water. "That must be Maria's house," Annie said. "I hope so," said Susan, "because it's really late and I don't want to get in trouble. I need to be home by dinner." "I don't see any lights. Maybe we shouldn't go," Annie said. "Don't be silly," Catherine said. "We've come all this way." "But it is awfully late," added Susan. "I just want to see how Maria is, and then we can go right home," assured Catherine. But by the time the girls reached the rundown shack, a thick, wet evening fog had crept in, heavy with a tang of salt. The girls whispered to one another. They quickly went up the stairs and stopped at the rickety porch. Around the corner they could see a little pier with no boat tied to it. Everything was quiet, except for the roar of the waves hitting the shore. "I don't think there's anyone home. Let's go," urged Annie. The mist was swirling so thickly around the girls that they could no longer see the distant roofs of Monterey. Tentacles of fog were tangling in the live oak and pine far up the hillside. "Would you stop being such a scaredy cat?" said Catherine, irritated. And boldly, she walked up to the door and she knocked 1, 2, 3 times. When there was no response, she pounded on the door even louder. "Let's look in a window," suggested Susan, for it was obvious that there was no one coming to answer the door. So they tiptoed to the nearest window and they peeked in past ragged curtains. At first, all they saw was an empty room with a lamp and a wind table. Opposite the window that they were looking through was a single closed door. Suddenly, a strange glow began to seep from under the door. Slowly, the door began to open, and there was Maria Coulter, framed in an unearthly light. She was standing upright, but her eyes were shut. Without a sound, the girl, like a sleepwalker, crossed the room. A moment later, the girls on the porch heard the cabin's front door unlock with a loud click, and the door opened with a loud squeal. Catherine, Annie, and Susan looked at one another for a moment, and then they went in front of the door and they looked through. The room was empty again, and the door at the far right was closed, though they could still see the line of curious light that was shining underneath it. Their friend had vanished. Catherine boldly went into the room and she yelled, "Maria, we just want to say hello. You can come out now." And she started to reach for the knob of the closed door when something stopped her. There was a smell of salt water, so strong that the girls could taste the salt. The odor of fish was strong enough to make Susan hold her nose. And the roar of the ocean filled the room as if it were swirling outside the house. "Catherine," Annie said, her voice barely a squeal. "Look, the door." Water was beginning to seep from under the door, and it soaked the worn carpet, and the girls backed away, afraid to let the water touch their shoes. Abruptly, they were startled by a loud crash that sounded like a wave hitting the closed door. A moment later, another blow shuttered the door. The girls gaped, too terrified to move. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the gurgle of the water that was still seeping out from the door, they heard a ghostly voice, and it sounded like a girl was calling from underwater. "Annie!" it said. "Catherine! Susan! I knew you would come! I'll be right there in a minute." At last, there was a final boom against the door. And in the silence that followed, it smelled of fish and salt and seaweed. The door opened. And at first the girls just saw this strange light. The water on the floor looked like a tide pool in the moonlight. And then they saw a young girl's hand, pale as whitefish, wet and wrinkled as something that has lain in the water too long. Terrified, the girls ran from the shack out into the wet, thick fog. They kept running, and they ran as fast as they could until they were back in their neighborhood. And it was there that they caught their breath and tried to make sense of what they saw. Terrified and confused, they finally told their parents what had happened. It was Catherine's father who told them. Richard Coulter's boat sank 3 days ago. They found his body near Point Lobos. His little girl, Maria, drowned with him, but they haven't found her body yet.